I am Alexa, and this is Alex, our resident product expert.
Hey, hey, how's everyone doing out there?
We've launched a poll, so we'd love to hear from you to find out what your job title is and what kind of your focus is for today's call based on your role and responsibilities. I'm going to be hosting, but I'll mainly be managing the chat and any questions that come in on the Q&A, and I'll primarily be passing the mic off to Alex here, who will be leading us through today's demo.
I guess you guys get to hear from me a lot today. Thanks for the intro, Alexa. Yes, welcome to Inside Float. I'm Alexandria Patinia. I am your resident product expert today. We are going to get a live look at smarter resourcing together. As you get acclimated, have a look at the chat, get familiar with everything that's there, all those buttons. That's also where you can post your questions. We'd love if you could actually pop them in the item that says Q&A if possible. But either way, we'll try to manage them wherever they end up. And we'll try to get to as many as possible before the end of the session, hopefully. So get your spicy questions in. Don't forget about it. Feel free to put them in as we're going through the demo as well. We'll come back to them at the end. So let's look at how we're going to spend our 30 minutes together. So I'm going to walk you through 3 different scenarios together with us. The first one will examine how you can monitor and adjust your live resourcing plan to react to changes as work comes in. Number 2, we'll talk about how you can scope and estimate new project work. And then number 3, we'll talk about how you can measure and track performance targets like utilization, billability, and margins. But first, a little background on Float. If you weren't aware, we've been around since 2011, and we were actually founded by 2 ex-agency leaders. So we have really deep ties to the professional services space, and we have a really deep understanding of what it takes to run everything in that kind of environment smoothly, especially in environments where you have limited resources and multiple projects or clients that are kind of competing for those resources. This is also a common problem we see with in-house teams too. So if you're from an in-house space, particularly in the creative or technical space, we see you still. And the platform is really designed intentionally for the space, which we also feel like is reflected in our 3-time #1 ranking on G2. Actually, these badges you're seeing here are hot off the press. They were just released today, so they're brand new. But you also might notice that some of the awards we've gotten, including most implementable and fastest implementation, really reflect what we're hoping to show you and what we're hoping to achieve today, which is that most of our customers are able to get up and running within 2 to 3 months of first starting with Float. So hopefully with this introduction, we'll get you set up on the right foot and get you up and running. Okay. That's enough of me talking about this. Without further ado, I am going to flip over to my demo. So before we dive into our deep dive demo and the scenarios that I've talked to you about earlier, one of the things that I want to cover is just a little bit of information around this demo environment we're working with today. So this is a fictitious mid-sized marketing and advertising agency. They work on different projects like digital ads, brand campaigns, and different website builds. They also have team members from 2 offices sharing the one account. They have team members from their London office and their New York City office on this account. And that's so they can share resources between those 2 offices together. Now, one of the amazing things that you'll see when you look at the Float resourcing schedule, which is what we're looking at today, is actually how visual it is. And the great thing that clients often love about the Float resourcing schedule is that it's color-coded. It's a simple and small thing, but it's pretty incredible when you think about it. So what you can do is you can color-code your schedule based on a client work, for example. And that makes it really easy to know who's working on what, when, with visual indicators to show you that. So whether you're a team member or a resourcing manager, you know that every time you see the color pink, someone's working with the client standard select, or perhaps every time you see the dark blue, you know that they're working with your client core. So I mentioned I was going to step through a couple scenarios. And the first scenario I want to step you all through is that of a resource manager and how you can plan and reallocate live work as it's happening. So I'm going to put on my resource manager hat today. We're looking at our schedule view right now, which is the live view of who's working on what, so I can plan and allocate work. And the first thing that I'm going to do as a resource manager is I'm going to think a little bit further forward. So I'm already looking into next week. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag my mouse over the next week's allocations. What that does is it activates floats, what we call date range insights. And that's going to pull up my team's utilization. The reason I want to see this is because I want to make sure that my team members aren't over capacity, but they're also not underutilized. So this gives me a great visual indicator of who's working on what and also how well utilized they are. I can see that my team overall is at an 81.7% capacity, which is great. But I can also see there's 1.6 hours of overtime.
Well, to interject there for a second, Alex, on utilization, and you're like, oh, 81% is great. Is 81% a common benchmark, over 80% a common benchmark you see in industries like professional services? Or, I personally might have imagined that we're always trying to aim for 100%. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, totally. So it always depends on the different customer and what their ultimate goals are. Some prefer 100%, some prefer 81 or just over 80%. And it kind of depends on how you set up float as well, because you can set your max capacity to be 7 hours a day. And if that's the case, then you're accounting for that sort of extra space that you need for non-billable work, like company meetings and things like that. And in that case, you might want to set your utilization goal higher. But in this case, we haven't set up float. We've set up float to be on an 8-hour schedule. And so what we're really trying to do by setting our utilization goal at about 80% is to give space for all of those other tasks that happen outside of client work, meetings, non-billable company admin type stuff that we need to make sure to account for when we're doing that. But it does vary customer to customer.
Okay, yeah, that's super helpful. Obviously, there's things outside of our control. People aren't going to be, working on that project 100% of the time. They do need to have meetings probably to discuss other things. Okay, got it.
That's right. So in this demo environment, we're targeting over 80%. But the other thing that we want to kind of pay attention to as a resource manager is this 1.6 hours of overtime. So this is telling me that somewhere on my schedule, somebody's over capacity. And like I mentioned before, float is super visual. So the great thing about this is I don't have to look too far to figure out where this overcapacity is coming from. If I scroll down, I'm immediately greeted by some red on the screen here that's telling me what's happening. So what I can see here is that Nick is a red at 102% capacity. And I can see that it's not his whole week that's causing his capacity to go over. It's just this a recent task that was added to his schedule for Monday and Tuesday that's now causing him to go over capacity. And what I can see when I hover over it is that this is a brand new client request that has come through and landed on his schedule, and it needs to get done before July 15th. But we obviously don't want Nick working overtime all the time to try to make this happen. So as the resource manager, it's my job to try and figure out how to reallocate this work so that Nick's happy and the team's happy and everyone's well utilized, right? So the first thing I'm going to do in Float is I am going to go to my filter and find other people that are similar to Nick. And in this case, Nick is a web developer. So I'm going to filter by role and find my web developers. And Float's automatically going to filter down my list to show me all the web developers we have on staff. So what I can see here is I have 2 other web developers on staff. I've got Julie and I've got Sarah. And we have a freelancer who we sometimes work with occasionally part-time to do our work for us. So my first inclination would just be to simply move this animation and interaction design task down to Sarah. She's only at 70% capacity and looks like she has some availability. But one of the amazing other things about Float is that it's not just about reallocating work based on who's available. it's really about trying to match skill sets to the work at hand. So we can see that Nick has a very unique skill set for a web developer in animation and interaction design, which is why he ended up with this animation task in the first place. And if we were trying to reallocate this to Sarah, she does not have that same skill set. It really does not make sense for us to reallocate this animation tasks down to Sarah. But if we look at our freelancer, we can see that they do actually have the capabilities that we're looking for. So in theory, we could just move this down to the freelancer, reach out to them and move it from tentative to confirmed, and we're done. But what if the freelancer is not an option for some reason? Perhaps the budget on this project doesn't accommodate for that, and it's just not going to work out for whatever reason. Well, we have another option. So thanks to the visual nature of the float schedule, I can see when I look forward to next week that Nick is working on a SEO optimization for our client core. Now I can see in the previous week, Sarah has also worked with our client core. So perhaps another option for me to reallocate this work that might make sense is to just give Sarah the core task. She's already familiar with the client and has the capacity to do so next week, and shift over this digital ad variation task so that we can move this animation task into next week, mark it as confirmed, and then we're still hitting our client goal of getting this done before July 15th. So it's a win-win for everybody, Alexa.
Yeah, that's great. And what I really liked also is just the powerful nature of the tags. You could use so many of those to really get nuanced with matching the right people to the right projects. So yeah, this was really great to see.
Yeah, the tags are super flexible, right? So now we've gone through what it looks like when we're resourcing active work that's happening. But now I want to swap to a different scenario and put on a slightly different hat. What happens when we have a new request from either a pre-existing client or a new client where they want to understand how much is this going to cost the business to do this work? So I'm going to put on my project manager hat for a second. And in this scenario, we've just gotten a new request from an existing client that we have. Our client's called Aero Engineering, and they want to know how much it's going to cost to build a new homepage for them. Now, we want to make sure that we're not giving them a price that is going to undercut our margins. So there is a way to see how much this is going to cost us in resources to make sure that we have margins in mind from the start when we're planning the project. And to do that, Alexa, we are going to head to the project plan. Now, when we land on the project plan, what we see here is an overarching view of all the projects that we have in flight across the business. So as a PM, this is great for me to understand what my other counterparts are working on as it's happening. And I can also see this in a timeline view by different stages. So these are what we call phases here, and it's showing me where these projects are at as well as the budget remaining. But as I said before, we're actually looking at costing a brand new project. So to do that, we're going to go to the upper right-hand corner and create a new project. And Float gives us the option to choose a status. Now, what this is going to mean is whether or not our team members are notified and whether or not that project appears on the main resourcing schedule. So in this case, I'm going to create the project as draft because it's something that I want to sort of rough out and see how things are going to come to life. It's not something I want shared in the main resourcing schedule. But perhaps once the client has signed and we're ready to sort of start putting more details behind this plan, we'd move it to tentative and then eventually confirmed once everything's locked in. Regardless, we're going to go into draft. And for the sake of today's demo and not spending a ton of time filling in a lot of information, I'm actually going to use a template for this project.
Ooh, okay. So on templates for a second. Do you need to build those in advance if you're building a project? Or if I'm just starting to build a project now, could I easily turn this into a template that I could also use in the future? How do they work?
Yeah, you can do it both ways, actually.
Oh, nice.
So once you have done a couple projects in Float that you're really proud of, that sort of represent the core types of client work that you do, you can save a former project as a template. It will remove some of the key things like the dates and stuff from the previous template or from the previous project. And you can save that as a template and you can reuse it every time. Or you can pre-create them like a skeleton and you can sort of refine them as you go.
Okay, I love that. Yeah, because I'm assuming, folks might know they're selling, a new homepage to a lot of different clients, right? So they know generally the steps are going to stay the same, easy to use, a repeatable template, or maybe they sold a discovery that could change and flex depending on the client. So they might not have the template ready yet, but then it could set the standard for later turning it into a template when it becomes more repeatable.
That's right.
Awesome.
So I'm not going to go through every single field on this project space, but there's a couple I'm going to draw your attention to as we go through. So we need to make sure to mark this project as billable. That's how Float's going to know to do some of the calculations that I'm going to show you in a moment. We can, of course, add in as much or as little details we want at this point, but we know from Arrow that they want this project to start out on July 1st. So we'll go ahead and mark that out. And because of the template, it already knows I use like 4 months for these type of projects. So that's how it's filling out November 30th. And then typically I would recommend that you always set a budget. However, in this scenario, we don't have a budget yet. We're actually going to be building out the structure that we need to define that budget better. So we're going to leave this set to no budget and come back to set it after we've finished costing out the project. On the team member side, from the template, I've added team members I know I need for these types of projects, like our copywriter, our designer, etc. But you can also add them later as we're going through the plan. And then this is also pulled in phases. So I've assigned different stages to the project. So we know we typically go through these stages when we're doing the project. It also allows you to track scheduled and logged hours against different phases. If you want to do that, you can use them to delineate that time. And if you want to break the time out even further, you can add different task activities so you can see exactly where people are spending their time if you need to later in the game. Plus, you can also add milestones for big dates like client handovers, go lives, etc. So I have enough information to sort of create this project for costing it out. So I'm going to hit create. And then it's going to appear on my project plan. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the name of the project to enter the focus project view. So if I scroll over to that July 1st date, you can see my phases across the top and you can see my team members on the side. But what I want you to pay real attention to during this demo, and you too, Alexa, is this cost field here. So what we're going to do is we're going to start roughing out our plan. So Caleb is our copywriter. And we know that we don't necessarily need him for the very beginning of the project, but we also need to make sure that the copy is written before the website design starts, which is right here. So we definitely need him at probably 100% for the first couple weeks. And then maybe we know we're going to drop him back quite significantly for the design phase to perhaps about 20% for the rest of that design phase. He's just helping out our designer at this point. Then Chin is our creative director. So they're really just in an advisory position. Plus, we want to minimize the amount of hours that we're utilizing Chin for because it's a very expensive resource. So we're just using them really in the discovery phase just to make sure we've got the idea right. So we're going to use them for about 10% just at the beginning of the project to set the tone. Same thing with Pam. Pam is our brand and PR person, and Pam really needs to just be involved up front just to make sure there's consistency in the Arrow branding. So we'll put her at also about 10% for the beginning of the project.
And on the topic of percentages here, if I wanted to allocate based on hours versus percentages, is that also easy?
Yeah, you actually can do either or. I find it easier to use percentages at the beginning and then perhaps your resource manager switches to or converts to hours when they're on the live schedule. But you can use a combination of both in Float. Actually, you can put some things in hours, some things in percentages. It all nets out the same in the end, actually. So in the background, the system knows that 10% equals a certain number of hours.
Okay.
And it's going to be able to calculate that information in your reports.
Okay, very cool.
Yeah, it is. It's really nice, actually. So you can be super flexible with the way that you allocate. Now, continuing on with our plan and keeping in mind that this cost field seems to be going up every time I'm allocating. And that is exactly what I want you to notice about this view. So Elena is our designer. And we know that we're going to need her mainly in that design phase, probably at 100% throughout the entirety of that phase. So we'll drag this across to make sure that she's 100% allocated during that time period, and maybe just a little bit allocated during the build, just for good measure. And Ivan is our account manager, so we don't really need him too much except at the beginning and end of the project. So we'll add him for about 20% at the beginning to close out that deal. And we've got a handover in here, and we'll add him there for that last piece of the handover, just to make sure everything goes according to plan. And then Nick is the star of our show here. He's our web developer. So he's the main person building this page. So we know that we're going to need him probably at 100% through the build phase, where we think we need him at 100%. We'll see here. And then for handover to the client, he still needs to be involved to make sure they understand what's happening. So we're going to knock down his allocation quite a bit. We'll knock him back to like 50% during the handover. And now we can see, if we're happy with this plan and we think we've added in enough contingency, we can see that my cost has totaled up to be about $30,000 with each of these resources involved, based on their cost rates and the time assigned. So Alexa, now what we have is a pretty good cost figure to advise our accounts team on what we think this project should be set at. So we know as a team that we like to make about a 50% margin if we can on all of our projects. So we're going to pitch to the accounts team that they go back to the client and sell this for about $60,000. Now, I know that these pitches don't always go to plan, but let's just assume for the sake of this demo that the client says, great, $60,000, we can do that. Once they agree to that, we're going to come back into this plan and we're going to add our budget. And Float offers different budget types depending on how you sell your projects. Obviously, the $60,000 is a fixed fee project, so it's going to be a fee-based budget. But you can also do time and materials by hourly fee, or you can do a bucket of hours. Today, we'll put in the $60,000. And when I update that, you can see now the system is able to automatically calculate my margin. And it's just under 50%, but let's just say we're happy with that point. Now we have a good idea of what our margin is going to be if we stay to this plan as it is today. And hopefully we've built in enough contingency that we feel like we can. So our next step is, once the client signs, we're going to flip this from draft to tentative. And when we do that, it's going to flow onto the live resourcing schedule and block out that time for our team members. But there's one thing we might want to do first, and that is we might want to check that the people that we've assigned this work to are actually free to do this work. And you can actually see that in this view as well. What I do is I adjust the view. I go to the display options and I turn on the show other allocations and overtime. And it's that same visual view for me. What I can immediately see is where there are conflicts, if any, in my plan. And it looks like for the most part, we're good, except for Nick. And the reason that he's not good is he has this small retainer that he works on for 20% of the time. So now we know if we want to send this to tentative or confirmed, we need to either ask for a new resource, swap out Nick for somebody else on our team, or we go back to the client and we say, can we get this done with that 80% hours?
That's super intuitive. I really like this. And what's great here is that we're catching things early. So, I mean, this is a theoretical scenario, but you, as the resource manager, have basically mapped out, generally speaking, what it's going to take to hit this deadline. And you've flagged early on that there could be some potential red zoning happening and planned for that in advance so that it's not mid project Nick's pulling his hair out because no one could see that he was already allocated to the retainer.
That's right. The whole idea behind this is to scope it out early so you can catch those things immediately,
Yeah.
and you can move around to address them as needed. So we've now looked at two scenarios. We've looked at how you reallocate and balance work on the live schedule. We've looked at how you can cost out and set budgets for net new work based on the resources you have at hand. And there's one more scenario that I want to go through. And that scenario is about tracking how you're doing over time. So in this case, I'm going to put on my leadership hat to look for trends on utilization, billability, margins, and budget utilization. But this information is honestly useful for a lot of different roles. So what I'm going to do is to view this information float, I'm going to do that from our report screen. And typically, we're going to be looking at data over time. Of course, you can always adjust the date ranges, but in this case, we're going to be looking at last quarter to see if we had any utilization trends or any margin trends that we need to dig into. Now, Alexa, Float has two different report options and styles overall. We have our people report and we have our project report. So the people report is really good for digging into data, as it says, around people, departments, and roles. So this is where you're probably going to go to pull the majority of your utilization data. And the project report, while you can still see some of the hours that are scheduled, is better for looking at budget utilization and margins and those kind of things. Now, what I see on this report right now is logged versus scheduled. So Float also has different dimensions that you can look at this information through the lens of. And in order to see the logged data, so the information in purple, we have to be using Float time tracking. If you aren't using Float time tracking or you use a different tool or whatnot, then what you'll see is actually just the information around your scheduled hours, which is obviously still very valuable. Now, when I come to this report, I actually like to go to the table more than I use the graphs, although they're helpful for comparing how I'm doing between scheduled and logged hours. And if I'm looking for billable utilization, the information is right there for me. So what I can see here is I can see that my team last quarter logged 22.8 thousand hours of actuals. And then I can see that we scheduled 22.5. Now, this is a little bit of an unusual situation. Typically, your scheduled hours are going to exceed your logged hours. So what we can look for in the data as well is Float's telling us that someone, either our scheduling is not super accurate yet, we need to refine the way we're scheduling and guessing about things, or someone's actually just logging time to a client over what they should be. So either way, we've got some good inference around this information that we can go and action for our future. Now, one of the things that we were looking for is billable utilization. Well, depending on how we report it, whether we use actuals to report that or scheduled time, is where you're going to see the information here. So we can see if we're using actuals that we had a billable utilization overall of 83%. That's great. I think that's right where we want to be for this client. Now, another great use of this report is actually if we scroll down, we can see this information broken down by person or role, which is helpful, or department. And where this is actually really, really helpful is forecasting staffing for your team. So what you can see here on this report is you can begin to see if there's, quarter over quarter trends around teams that are over or underutilized. And here we can see that our engineering team was over as well as our PMO team. So that's a great indicator to me that perhaps we need to look at whether or not we need to bring in more support in this space. We can actually even drill down further to see if it's just one person that's causing this issue, like we're depending on someone a little too much, or if it's the overall team that's over-resourced and we need to consider hiring in more people or bringing in freelance support, etc. I can also view my time off and overtime as well on some of these reports, which can be helpful for reporting on that information too. So Alexa, that is the utilization side of things, but what about the project margins or the budget utilization information? For that, we're going to flip to the projects report.
Yeah, let's dig into the money side of things. We want to know.
Yeah, exactly. So this report is going to show us the breakdown based on project or by client, right? Because we can associate clients to multiple projects and look at that information as well. And it's going to show us budget and scheduled hours again, but this time from the view of the project instead of the view of the person. But what's really unique about this view as opposed to other spaces that we've looked at, especially for a project manager, we can actually click on a particular project that we own. And if it's in flight and we flip this view from logged versus scheduled to past logged and future scheduled, what we can see here is a whole summary of what's happening on the project. So we can see all of the hours that have been logged so far in purple and all that are still pending. So all that are on the schedule so far up to the completion of the project, where that is in terms of our budget, which is also reflected here. How much those hours account for in terms of a dollar value for what's scheduled in the future, where that puts us at projected billable, what our projected costs are, and most importantly, what our in-flight margin is. So
awesome.
we can
sorry to interrupt here, Alex, but I'm really fixated on this piece, which is, it looks like we sold the project for 100K. We've only got about 12K left to future schedule, which means that we're amounting to about 80,000. That margin is great, but is there a way to drill in here and see why we're leaving $20,000 on the table?
Sure. So while the margin tells us a great story about the project, if we scroll down here, we can also see how we're doing based on how much time has been allocated to different phases. We can look at the task level for individual activity and the actuals from the time tracking. So there's a lot of detail behind these reports that you can sort of unpack and begin to figure out as you go through this information. But what I really love about this report, Alexa, is that I'm not just looking at our estimations for the project. I'm not just looking at what's actually happened so far. I can actually combine them together to get a real-time view of how things are progressing, so that if I know that I'm going to be able to keep my margins within a certain range throughout the entirety of the project, then I'm much more free about how we're using our resources and what we're doing, versus if my margins are really tight at a specific point in the project, then I know I need to make some quick adjustments now to make sure that we stay under budget for the future.
Yeah, okay, that's super helpful.
Perfect. Okay, so we've looked at the people and projects report and how you can look at actuals data or scheduled data and how you find utilization, billability trends, and also how you look at margins. So I think we've covered most of it. What do you think, Alexa?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex.
Yeah. All right. Let's kick back over to the Q&A now, I think.
Awesome. Okay, so I received 2 DM questions and I'm going to pull them up on stage now. Again, folks, I know we're a little over time, so don't fret. You'll get the answers to these questions in the recording as well if you can't stay. But here we go. The first question for you, Alex.
Okay.
If I'm already using a project management tool, how do I know when it's time to bring float in too?
This is not completely uncommon scenario. We actually see a lot of teams using float and a project management tool in conjunction with one another. That's for like 2 different things. One is for like deep task-based to do sort of planning, and that's where they're using the project management tool the most. And for Float, they're looking at the bigger picture, like the depth of the effort that's involved for a particular piece of work, and we're looking for conflicts. So if you're struggling with figuring out whether a particular resource is on one thing versus another, if you are struggling to figure out how much billable time is being attributed to a piece of work, if you're looking for utilization information, capacity, profit margins, and rates all in one space, and looking at the project from a higher level, or need to look at the project from a higher level, that's where really it's time to invest in a resource management tool.
Okay, got it. Yeah, like very specific use case there. Okay, and then the second question, can you share a favorite customer use case where Float really made a difference? And putting you on the spot, Alex, if you have like a link to this customer case study at all as well. If not, I can drop it later as well. The post.
Honestly, I think you knew what I was going to say then, because we did just do a case study with Instrument, who is like a leading marketing and advertising agency here in the US. They do some really cool projects, and they really use Float in all different elements of their planning process of their client work. So that one is definitely one of my newest favorites. I do have recency bias, and I will say, like, from a use case standpoint or how customers are using the product, obviously our schedule that you all saw just now is like our bread and butter. That's where we started. But I spend a lot of time working with new products and new things that Float's doing. And so right now I'm really partial to our profitability tracking and how we're starting to integrate that into what will soon be, whether I'm ready to reveal this or not, but what will soon be like a nice estimations workflow for costing out projects, seeing what different scenarios look like when you trade resources in and out of a piece of work. So I'm pretty bullish on that one right now. But there's plenty of value to be had in what the product does today.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much. We won't keep you all much longer. As I mentioned, recording will be sent your way, and we will follow up afterwards with everything you need. But feel free to message us to reply to any of the emails you might have received from me directly if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll make sure to answer.
Absolutely. Good to see everybody. Thanks.